This is the nameless protagonist. Today's video is inspired from a broadcast held by the Angryman, where he articulated some profound observations. While the video is no longer up, I'll be speaking to the origins of many of the points made, while simultaneously addressing a serious question. Why, in all this time, do we seem powerless in the most powerful country in the world? Personally, I think the answer can be found in the fact that we tend to immediately defer most of our power in the form of ritual sacrifice, usually unknowingly. But we'll get to that later. What I say next is a series of observations and are not intended to serve as an excuse or an attack on anybody. This is a status report that I submit to the sphere to do with as it will. For the overwhelming majority of this country's history, we've been enslaved rather than free. Literally. In the book The American Slave Coast by Constance and Ned Subdelay, we read about how the idea of a temporary indentured servitude, by necessity, became a permanent slave class one was born into on the status of the mother. Having been marked for ownership, you would spend the rest of your life paying back this debt, measured by your perceived value, doing work we're all familiar with by now. This would plant the seeds of overwhelming desire for women to shrug off the yoke of this title, slave, and feed the need for acceptance into the greater society. Also, this would be the start of the hidden resentment placed upon men, who would later be scorned for not ending slavery, and the birth of the fear, which lasts to this day, that black men, if given the opportunity, would make them the slaves they once were in retribution. The result was a systematic process of maintaining black men in a state of being merely male and relegated to being either breeders or laborers, as explained in the Grinch's book, The Ratchet's Rouge. Plantation politics, in other words. This ensured that black men were kept in a state of complete exhaustion, never able to take measure of his situation, and virtually never, if ever, given the opportunity to have a family, let alone be the leader of a household. Should he decide to step up, or, upon arrival to the plantation, demonstrate a spirit of defiance, ritual emasculation was usually the response in a process called buck breaking. This normally involved being whipped and oftentimes sodomized by the slave owner in front of everyone on the plantation to see. He was reduced to a non-human, where all pretensions of masculinity remained stifled at the stage of, quote, boy, end quote, and never allowed to progress further. The lasting psychological and cultural effects of this process are echoed in Dr. Tommy Curry's book, The Man Not, and often elaborated further in Dr. Francis Quest Welsing's book, The ISIS Papers. The fear of black men is a very intrinsic part of the social heritage in this culture. Females, however, were not exempt from this process, but things played out in a far more nuanced way. They were born into a state of de facto placement over men on the plantation. This was due not by some measure of a degree of privilege one had over the other, but more so due to the degree of punishment for infractions on what took place. If you couple this with the post-1812 practice of baby farming, introduced by Thomas Jefferson, outside of a few select stud slaves later to be called mandingos, women would be valued for their ability to produce up to 12 children at a time, which would result in 12 separate instances of debt, and thus credit acceptable by banks as collateral. They were, in other words, capital. Centuries of this policy would enforce the social inertia which rings true to this day, that the black family unit, in quote, therefore, consists primarily of the woman and child. This is possible because the, quote, man, in quote, was the owner of the plantation, and would later in the future become the state. This is important. We know slave owners sired many children like this, but given that the status of slave was inherited by the mother, all he would ever produce legally with her would be more slaves. This would further animate in the minds of women this need of acceptance, but would typically doom her to the status of concubine, giving rise to this term bedwench, whose offspring would become a soft buffer class. It should be noted that this practice is what likely helped kick off the slave trade in the first place as we understand it, and became a kind of contained culture in its own right. In the book Daughters of the Trade by Pernell Ibsen, this dynamic is spelled out in great detail, with the movie Eve's Bayou showing how this concept progressed well into the 1800s. The Spanish and the French were particularly noted to be very liberal pursuers of this ideology, creating the vast majority of what we call in the West Creole culture. Why did I spend so much time explaining the past? It's because behavior, psychology, and ritual are all related. Any ritual which you do not take conscious agency over tends to instead manifest subconsciously, and this ritual of seeking acceptance and sacrificing each other to attain it is the very feedback loop we've been caught in ever since we left the Reconstruction era. The remainder of this video will be dedicated to connecting these dots carefully. We will begin with the Moynihan Report of 1965. This report was comprised of the aggregated research of post-slave narratives and social anthropology from the likes of Dr. Fraser and W.E.B. Du Bois, with the Philadelphia Negro Report. In an effort to understand the social unrest in the Black community in the wake of civil rights legislation being passed and the assassination of Malcolm X earlier, the agenda on the table was integration of our demographic into the greater society. It was concluded that the community did not see its men as worth investing in over the women, and unless the men were empowered by the state, that the Black community would further decline. This would end up being a prophecy that would prove to be very much so true later on in the future. This motion to empower Black men would have gone through, had it not been for the very Black matriarchy identified by Fraser and Moynihan stepping forward from the shadows and interceding politically. They postulated that the very suggestion to empower Black men would be the perpetuation of oppression and a doctrine that was slowly being recognized as intersectional feminism. The Black Power movement, as we understood it, was in direct response to the perceived apathy of the state and the lack of change, even though civil rights was said to have been disseminated. This is the beginning of the talk of revolution and revolt, and this looked to be a very real potentiality. All the elements were in place, but so was COINTELPRO. The shadow of J. Edgar Hoover loomed over the Black Power movement as it pushed into college campuses across the country at the exact same time feminism did. While true that the message of resistance and reform caught like wildfire, so too did the shadow hand in framing, setting up, slandering, and flat out assassinating, like in the case with Fred Hampton, many men who would be able to act as a force multiplier. It was in that time that much of the movement found itself in the hands of the women, and at the same time the attack order was given. The likes of Angela Davis began equating concepts such as white supremacy to patriarchy, and planting the seeds of what would soon be understood as intersectional feminism. Women in droves began to abandon the Black liberation movement and/or rebranded it to subscribe to another message. This message being that Black liberation could not happen without Black female liberation. Liberation, of course, being as they defined it. Over time, Black men adhered to this belief, never taking the time to truly ask, liberation from what? I believe they mean the social contract, but more on that at a little bit later date. The infiltration of intersectionalism into the Black Power movement and ultimately Black media would be a process of osmosis. when several queer-identified women came together to manifest its tenets in an event known as the Coombe River Collective. They incorporated the message of Gloria Steinem to produce black feminist influencers such as Alice Walker, also known as the creator of the color purple, and the womanist doctrines. This was a long time coming, as this country had long since been matriarchal, going back to the advent of preferential treatment to give mothers control of the fate of the children over the father. BGS has highlighted this legislative starting point going back to the Tender Years Doctrine, which piggybacks off case law leading back to the 1800s, which implies that a child should be with the mother until the age of 4. That number in later years would increase further once child labor laws created the legal status and classification for children. With the advent of no-fault divorce, birth control, and abortion, social programs to substitute financial dispositions with legal income stipulation, known as welfare, favoritism in court for child custody, and lastly, child support enforcement as a lucrative private business, you get the succession of women, black women in particular, from the social contract remained from the days prior with the patriarchy before the suffrage movement. This gave rise to the idea of the independent woman, who would declare themselves the mother and the father, wielding shame and what Dr. T. Hassan Johnson labels as proxy violence from the state as a corrective tool of enforcement. The children then found themselves born into a state of compromise, very similar to what has transpired on the plantation over a century prior. This leads us full circle back to the start of this video. Men were not only expected to uphold their end of the social contract, but to see a woman's participation of it on her end as not only optional, but a privilege. For insult to injury, it was rebranded as egalitarianism, or 50-50 doctrine, as noted in the book The Richer Sex by Liza Mundy. However, in the black community, this gets called, quote, submission, end quote, as described by Jeannie Mai recently, to the protest of the gynocracy in the last few days. Policy animated by female nature, the likes of Briffeld's Law and hypergamy, was catered to and encouraged, whilst masculine nature was met with biological denialism and reimagined with negative synonyms associated with oppression and white supremacy. This would result in a charge that black men, somehow, were in a position to oppress women, black women specifically, purely on the basis for being male, while women were asserted to be in a double minority status, leaving men socially obligated to compensate their women for their condition. This left women as leaders of the community by default, donning the visage of the mother figure. The bulk of the responsibility was imposed on men, whilst women held a solid grasp on authority, solidifying it with state-granted power. Popular culture and TV would begin to internalize these intersectionalist ideas and meld into a socio-cultural identity known as the gynocracy. This template would fit perfectly over those born into the black community from there forward to create much of the current state we recognize the black community in today. For Gen X and early millennials, it haunted us in our media with songs like Dear Mama from Tupac, to television shows such as Living Single, movies like Waiting to Exhale, Oprah and the sea of talk shows speaking on black women's issues, and even the revised pro-black movements of the 90s really emphasized these points and talking points. For every one uninfluenced voice in the pro-black movement, 9 more would rise echoing the internalized intersectionalist points of view, usually without even being aware of it. In the case of the pro-black movement, however, I'd like to cite 2 major exceptions: the Nation of Islam, or NOI, its branches, as well as the Rastafarians, particularly Nyabingi House, Bobo Shanti, and the 12 Tribes Rastafarians. I mentioned those 2 exceptions because they were deeply rooted in fundamentally challenging Western culture as it's understood and championed Pan-Africanism. They are also the 2 most hostile towards the 3rd and 4th wave feminism and intersectionalist ideology without exception. But I'll get back on topic. These ingredients have been given the opportunity to mature and fester within universities all over the country, which shifted from being predominantly female. For the last 50 years, they've produced teachers, lawyers, administrators, judges, screenwriters, and authors in a network of control that calls itself progressive liberals and dominates the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, due to the efforts of Nixon and his Southern strategy, politically we've been led right into their hands. Animated by the tenets of intersectionalism, men in our country are reduced to a person of color, end quote, who happens to be black, whilst women have been postured to greater levels of entitlement legally by virtue of being female and someone of color, and lately, should they identify with an alternative lifestyle, an additional layer leading them to be triple minorities in some instances, such as the 3 queer identified creators of the Black Lives Matters organization. Knowing that intersectionalism has been the gateway that our power has been filtered through, and adding to the fact that we have a culture that is ultimately a gynocentric matriarchy, we are repeatedly trying to demand power without being in a position to take it, requiring the assistance of other groups of people with their own agendas that are not necessarily in our own best interests. This takes us right back to Angryman's observations. We lack the numbers to launch anything remotely martial in nature, largely in part thanks to Roe v. Wade. Also, we lack the logistical resources both materially and talent-wise, nor do we have foreign banking from other major countries. Also, lastly, and most embarrassingly, we don't even control the spaces we live in. However, we didn't get to this point by coincidence. Ironically, the things we could do to change our position would require a complete rethinking of how we look at our situation. We find ourselves clinging to an idea in an environment that no longer exists, with motives that may not even be of our own creation. This leads us to missing glaring wide open opportunities given to those with nothing to lose, the economic crisis serving as a hard reset button, and the advent of fourth wave industrialism opening up opportunities globally for us to simply seize that previously simply did not exist. We have literally been recreating the conditions of the plantation ritualistically since we left it, with few grand exceptions which were ruthlessly obliterated by the hand of the dominant society. While that merits its own conversations, such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida, and a few others, there's a wellspring of power we refuse to tap into, and I have an inkling as to why. For example, there's a great deal of people who will profess to being Christian. They will be willing to die for their religious beliefs, or so they say, but few of them have actually read the Bible in its entirety, nor do they believe everything that's written in that book. These same people will talk about how our ancestors died so that we could have the right to vote, but have no clue who their congressman or woman is, nor how many branches there are in the federal government, let alone what their purposes are. They will call you to vote for the presidency, but don't have a clue who their school superintendent is, or who will decide how much money their neighborhood gets of the county and state funds, or worse, draw them into a property tax line that will make their rent skyrocket. The power of voting is not so that you decide who gets in office based on who you like. The power in voting is so that legislation and policy that is to your benefit can be passed. From there, you reward them with your repeated cooperation. Likewise, you punish them by supporting somebody else who will if they fail to meet your expectations. In other words, voting is your gateway to power in a democracy. A democracy where majority rules. This is what it means to use the political system. A system, while you may not have created, a system the 13th Amendment entitles you to. Failure to realize this one issue speaks to one of two things. It means most have either never been taught to recognize this, which is ironic given that we speak slogans oftentimes such as power to the people, or the second and most likely situation, which is those who are benefiting from this current arrangement do not have a single interest in changing things whatsoever, and these individuals who benefit from it, an overwhelming majority seemingly, do not have a Y chromosome, which would explain a lot, and why I'm in favor of this being the result of the latter. There's power in ritual, and power that's not used will be used by someone else in your stead. This is why I see value in speaking truth to power, but I think there's greater value in instead being the power spoken to. Hopefully, this was enough to help answer the question posed at the very beginning. With enough interest, I'll do a part 2 and go deeper into the nature of this conversation. Feel free to comment below, but in the meantime, to the dojo, os. To the sphere, os. This has been the Nameless Protagonist.